April 7, 1945. Wildflecken Training Grounds, Bavaria. The 14th Armored Division rolled through collapsed German defences under a sky heavy with ash and spring rain. Among the captured were not combat troops, but 87 women, Nachrichtenhelferinnen, signals auxiliaries, who had operated radio equipment and decoded transmissions for Wehrmacht communications units withdrawing toward the Czechoslovakian border. They stood in a loose formation near the burned-out communications bunker, wearing grey wool uniforms soaked through, faces blank with exhaustion. Most were between 19 and 24. Their names would later appear in processing rosters: Hildegard Eberl, Margarete Schön, Anneliese Vollmer. They had not fired weapons. They had not seen the front. But they had heard it collapsing through static and fragments of panicked radio traffic for 3 weeks. The American soldiers who processed them spoke little. A military policeman checked identities. A medic examined wrists and necks for injuries. An officer with a clipboard wrote down unit designations and ranks. The women were told they would be transported west. No one said where. No one explained what would happen next. They climbed into the backs of canvas-topped trucks, sitting on wooden benches in silence. The convoy moved slowly through villages where white sheets hung from windows. Children stood in doorways. Smoke rose from distant tree lines. One woman, Anneliese, watched the horizon and thought of her younger brother, last seen in a panzer near Silo Heights. She had not heard from him in 9 days. The trucks turned onto a paved road heading toward the Rhine. Inside, someone whispered a question no one answered. They had been told stories of starvation camps, of reprisals, of Soviet brutality in the East. The rumors had circulated through the barracks for months. Now, in American custody, they did not know what awaited them. The rain drummed against the canvas. The engine rumbled. No one spoke again for 2 hours. April 8, 1945. Camp Ritchie, Maryland. The women arrived in darkness, stepping down from transport vehicles onto gravel paths lined with floodlights. The camp had been a training facility for military intelligence personnel. Now it served as a temporary internment site for Axis prisoners awaiting interrogation, reclassification, or transfer to labor details. They were led into a wooden processing hall. The air smelled of disinfectant and damp wool. A Red Cross officer stood behind a folding table, checking names against a manifest. Medical personnel inspected hands, throats, and scalps for lice or infection. A female interpreter, German-American, spoke calmly in Hochdeutsch, explaining the rules. No personal items, no jewelry, no letters. Everything would be catalogued and returned later. Hildegard Eberl handed over a small photograph of her mother. The interpreter placed it in a numbered envelope. Margarete Schön gave up a silver cross. Anneliese Vollmer had nothing but a wool scarf her grandmother had knitted. She folded it carefully and placed it on the table. They were assigned to barracks 16 through 18. Long, unheated structures with double-stacked cots and thin blankets. The windows had no curtains. The floors were cold pine. A single stove sat unlit in the center of each building. The women unpacked nothing, because they had nothing. They sat on the cots and waited. For the first 3 days, they received no information. Guards delivered water and hardtack biscuits twice daily. The latrines were outside, across a muddy yard. At night, searchlights swept the perimeter. The silence was not peaceful. It was the silence of waiting for something worse. Rumors began again. Someone said Soviet officers were arriving to take them east. Someone else said they would be sent to labor camps in France. A third woman, older, a former schoolteacher, said she had heard the Americans were feeding their prisoners soup made from potato peels and sawdust. No one knew what was true. No one had seen any other prisoners. The barracks felt like a place designed to hold people until decisions were made elsewhere. On the evening of April 10th, an announcement came over the camp loudspeakers, first in English, then in German. All female prisoners of war were to report to the main assembly hall at 800 hours the following morning. No further details were given. That night, Anneliese lay awake on her cot, staring at the ceiling beams. She thought of the stories she had heard in Bavaria, stories of reprisals, of starvation, of revenge. She thought of the radio traffic she had decoded in the final days before capture, the fragmentary transmissions from units being overrun, the silence that followed. She did not sleep. April 11th, 1945. 07:45 hours. The women assembled outside the barracks in the cold morning air. Frost clung to the grass. Guards escorted them in 2 columns toward the central assembly hall, a large Quonset hut with corrugated metal walls and a peaked roof. Smoke rose from a chimney at the far end. Hildegard walked near the front of the line. Her hands were numb. She kept them inside the sleeves of her uniform jacket. Beside her, Margaret whispered a question. "Do you think they'll separate us?" Hildegard did not answer. She had stopped making predictions. As they approached the hall, the scent reached them first. It was faint, then stronger. Roasted meat, baked bread, something sweet and unfamiliar. The line slowed. Someone near the back stopped walking. A guard gestured forward. The women moved again, more slowly now. The doors to the hall were open. Warm air poured out, carrying the smell with it. Inside, long wooden tables had been arranged in rows. White tablecloths covered each surface. Plates, forks, knives and cups were set at every place. At the far end of the hall, a serving line had been erected, staffed by American mess personnel in clean white aprons. The women entered in silence. They stood in the doorway, staring. On the tables, roasted chicken, mashed potatoes, green beans, white rolls with butter, pitchers of milk, bowls of canned fruit. Steam rose from metal trays. The food was real. It was abundant. It was arranged as if for a celebration. No one moved. The guards stepped aside. An American officer, a captain, stood near the front. He spoke through an interpreter. "You will be fed 3 meals a day. You will receive the same rations as American personnel stationed at this facility. You are protected under the Geneva Convention. You are not to be harmed." The interpreter repeated the words in German. Still, no one moved. Anneliese stood near the middle of the group. She looked at the tables, at the food, at the butter melting on the rolls. Her throat tightened. She thought of the last meal she had eaten in Bavaria, a piece of black bread and a cup of ersatz coffee made from acorns. She thought of the stories. She thought of the rumors. Beside her, a younger woman, barely 18, began to cry. She covered her face with her hands. Then another. Then Margaret. Then Hildegard. The sound spread through the hall, not loud, not hysterical, but quiet and breaking. Women stood with their hands over their mouths, with their heads down, with their shoulders shaking. They had expected punishment. They had expected starvation. They had expected revenge. They had not expected kindness. The American captain did not speak again. He stepped back and allowed the women to approach the tables at their own pace. Some moved quickly. Others remained frozen near the entrance. A Red Cross volunteer, an older woman with grey hair, walked among them, guiding them gently toward the seats. Anneliese sat down slowly. She placed her hands on the edge of the table, feeling the texture of the cloth. The plate in front of her was clean and heavy. The fork was metal, not wood. She picked up the roll and broke it in half. Steam rose from the center. She spread butter across it with a knife and took a small bite. The taste was overwhelming. She closed her eyes. She had not eaten bread with butter in 14 months. Across the table, Hildegard ate in silence, cutting the chicken into small pieces, chewing slowly, her eyes fixed on the plate. Margaret drank milk from a glass cup, gripping it with both hands. No one spoke. The only sounds were forks on plates, the clink of glasses, the quiet scrape of chairs. The mess personnel refilled trays without comment. When a pitcher of milk emptied, it was replaced. When the rolls ran out, more appeared. The Americans did not smile. They did not ask questions. They worked efficiently, professionally, as if this were simply their duty. After 20 minutes, the crying stopped. The women ate. Some ate quickly, some ate slowly. A few could not finish. One woman, pale and thin, stood and walked back to the serving line, holding her plate uncertainly. A cook gestured toward the mashed potatoes. She nodded. He served her another portion. By 09:30 hours, the hall had grown quiet again, but it was a different silence. The tension had broken. The fear had softened. The women sat at the tables, full for the first time in months, staring at the plates in front of them, as if trying to understand what had just happened. An American lieutenant, a woman in uniform, stood near the door with a clipboard. She made notes. She did not approach. Later, her report would state simply, emotional response significant, no resistance, full cooperation, meal concluded without incident. But the report did not capture what had occurred. It could not describe the moment when a prisoner realized she would not be starved. It could not record the weight of a fear that had been carried across borders, through surrender, through captivity, and then lifted in a single gesture. At 1,000 hours, the women were escorted back to the barracks. The tables were cleared. The hall was cleaned. By noon, it was empty again. April 14th, 1945. 3 days after the meal, Annalisa sat on her cot in Barrack 17, holding a pencil stub and a single sheet of paper provided by the Red Cross. She had been told she could write one letter. It would be read by censors. It would take weeks to arrive, if it arrived at all. She did not know if her mother was still alive. She did not know if her home still stood. She wrote carefully, in small script, to save space. Mutti, I am safe. I am in America. They are feeding us. Do not worry. She paused. The pencil hovered over the paper. She wanted to say more. She wanted to describe the hall, the tables, the butter on the rolls. She wanted to tell her mother that she had cried in front of strangers and had not felt ashamed. She wanted to say that for the first time since the war began, she had felt something other than fear. But there were no words for it, not in the space allowed, not in a letter that would be read by men in offices who did not know her. She finished the letter with a single line, I will come home when I can. She folded the paper and handed it to a Red Cross officer who collected letters each afternoon. The officer placed it in a canvas sack with dozens of others. Annalise watched it disappear. In the days that followed, the women settled into a routine. Morning assembly at 0700, breakfast in the mess hall, oatmeal, toast, coffee, work assignments at 0900, laundry duty, kitchen assistance, cleaning barracks, lunch at 1200, afternoon recreation period in a fenced yard, dinner at 1800, lights out at 2200. The food remained abundant. The guards remained distant, but not hostile. The women spoke more freely now, though never loudly. They exchanged names, hometowns, stories of families left behind. Hildegard learned that Margaret had worked in a telegraph office in Stuttgart before the war. Margaret learned that Annalisa had studied nursing for 6 months before being conscripted into signals work. They did not speak of ideology. They did not speak of politics. They spoke of brothers, fathers, mothers, of cities that no longer existed, of addresses that might be rubble, of waiting. On April 21st, a new group of prisoners arrived, 32 women captured near Nuremberg. They were processed, assigned to Barrack $19, and brought to the mess hall for their first meal. Annalise watched from across the room as they entered, saw the same disbelief, the same hesitation, the same breaking. She understood then that the meal was not an isolated event. It was policy. It was deliberate. The Americans were feeding every prisoner the same way, under the same rules, with the same quiet efficiency. It was not mercy. It was not kindness. It was something else, something colder, more impersonal, but no less profound. It was adherence to a rule that said prisoners would not be starved, regardless of what they had done, regardless of what their country had done, regardless of what anyone felt about it. Anneliese did not know if she believed in the rule, but she was alive because of it. May 3rd, 1945. The war in Europe ended 5 days later, but the women at Camp Ritchie did not know it yet. News travelled slowly through the internment system. Rumours circulated faster than facts. Someone said Berlin had fallen. Someone else said Hitler was dead. A third woman insisted the Allies had signed an armistice with a provisional government in Bavaria. No official announcement came. The daily routine continued unchanged. The women woke, ate, worked and slept under the same schedules, the same rules, the same distant authority. But something had shifted. The waiting had changed texture. It was no longer the waiting of fear. It was the waiting of uncertainty, not knowing what came next, not knowing when they would be released, not knowing what world they would return to. On the afternoon of May 8th, the camp loudspeakers crackled to life. The commandant's voice, translated by the German interpreter, announced that hostilities in Europe had officially ceased. The Third Reich had surrendered unconditionally. The war was over. The women sat in silence. No one cheered. No one wept. They sat on their cots, on the barrack steps, in the yard, and absorbed the words without reaction. Anneliese stood near the fence, gripping the cold metal wire. She thought of her brother. She thought of the transmission she had decoded on March 14th, a fragment from a panzer unit requesting artillery support near Kustrin. The response had been silence. She had not known then what the silence meant. She knew now. That evening, the mess hall served the same dinner as always: roasted pork, boiled potatoes, canned corn, white bread, apple pie. The women ate without speaking. The war was over, but they were still prisoners. The war was over, but they did not know what peace would look like. After dinner, back in Barrack 17, Hildegard sat on her cot and spoke aloud, her voice calm and flat. "They'll send us back." Margaret looked up from the floor where she was mending a torn sleeve. "Where? Germany? Where else?" "There is no Germany," Anneliese said quietly. She was standing by the window, looking out at the darkening sky. "There are occupation zones, British, American, Soviet, French, but no Germany." "Then where do we go?" No one answered. A younger woman, Clara, who had been captured near Regensburg, spoke from the far end of the barrack. "My city is gone. I saw photographs in the Red Cross office. The entire centre, destroyed. The cathedral, the bridges, the houses, gone." Another woman, Inga, added softly, "My family was in Dresden." The silence returned, heavier now. Anneliese turned from the window. She walked to the centre of the barrack and sat down on an empty cot. She looked at the women around her, faces she had come to recognize, voices she had come to know. "Do you remember what you thought?" she asked. "Before the meal, before the dinner in the hall, do you remember what you believed would happen?" Hildegard nodded slowly. "I thought they would let us starve. I thought they would beat us," Margaret said. "Or worse." Clara stared at her hands. "I thought they would put us on trains, send us east, to the Soviets." Anneliese nodded. "We were wrong. We were lied to," Inga said bitterly. "Yes," Anneliese agreed. "But we also believed the lies. We wanted to believe them. It was easier to believe the enemy was a monster than to believe we had been fighting for something that was already lost." Hildegard leaned forward, elbows on her knees. "Oh, what does it matter now?" "It matters," Anneliese said, "because we have to decide what we carry back with us, the lies or the truth." "What truth?" Margareta asked. "That they fed us, that they didn't kill us. That's not truth. That's just policy." "Maybe," Anneliese said, "but it's also a fact, and facts are the only things we have left." The conversation faded. The women returned to small tasks, mending, washing, writing letters that might never be sent. But the question remained unspoken, suspended in the air like dust in the light. What do you carry back? What do you tell the people who were not here? What do you say when someone asks, "What were the Americans like?" Do you tell them about the fear? Do you tell them about the meal? Do you tell them both? At 2200 hours, the lights were extinguished. The barrack fell into darkness. Outside, the searchlights continued their slow rotation. In the distance, a train whistle echoed across the Maryland countryside. Annalisa lay on her cot, staring at the underside of the bunk above her. She thought of her mother. She thought of the letter she had written 3 weeks ago, the letter that might be sitting in a postal depot somewhere, waiting to be delivered to an address that might no longer exist. She thought of the dinner, the chicken, the butter, the milk. She thought of the crying. She had not understood it then. She understood it now. They had cried not because they were grateful, but because they had been forced to confront the fact that they had been wrong, that the stories they had been told, the fears they had carried, the assumptions they had made about their enemies, all of it had been shattered in a single gesture. It was not kindness that had broken them. It was the realization that kindness was still possible, even here, even now, even after everything. And that realization was unbearable, because it meant the world was not what they had been taught to believe. It meant the war had not been what they had been told it was. It meant they had to go back and rebuild their lives on a foundation that no longer existed. Annalisa closed her eyes. She did not sleep for a long time. When she did, she dreamed of a table covered in white cloth, and plates that never emptied, and a silence that was not quite peace. June 1946. Anneliese Vollmer returned to Bavaria under a repatriation program coordinated by the American occupation authorities. She found her mother alive, living in the basement of their former home. The upper floors had been destroyed in an air raid in March 1945. Her brother's name appeared on a casualty list posted in the town square. Killed in action, February 3rd, 1945, near Kustrin. She did not speak of Camp Ritchie for many years. When asked about her time in American custody, she said only that she had been treated according to the rules. Hildegard Eberl married a British civil engineer in Hamburg in 1948. She worked as a translator for reconstruction offices until 1953. In a private letter to Annalisa, written in 1950, she described the dinner at Camp Ritchie as the first moment she understood that the war had consequences beyond victory and defeat. Margaret Schön immigrated to New York in 1947. She never returned to Germany. She worked as a seamstress in Queens and raised 2 children. In 1963, during an oral history interview, she was asked what she remembered most clearly about the war. She said, "The meal. The one they gave us when we thought they would let us starve." The policy that governed the treatment of prisoners at Camp Ritchie was not unique. It was replicated across hundreds of American-run internment facilities in Europe and the Pacific. It was derived from the 1929 Geneva Convention and reinforced by U.S. Army Field Manual 27-10, which specified that prisoners of war were entitled to rations equivalent to those provided to garrison troops of the detaining power. The policy was not mercy. It was not benevolence. It was bureaucracy, formalized and enforced. But for the prisoners who lived under it, the distinction was irrelevant. The outcome was the same. In 1998, the U.S. Army decommissioned Camp Ritchie. The barracks were dismantled. The assembly hall was demolished. The records were transferred to the National Archives in College Park, Maryland. Among them, processing rosters, medical reports, interrogation transcripts, and logistics manifests detailing food deliveries, meal schedules, and ration allocations. One document, dated April 11, 1945, lists the menu served to 87 female prisoners on their first day in the mess hall: roasted chicken, mashed potatoes, green beans, white rolls, butter, milk, canned peaches. There is no annotation, no explanation, no commentary, just the facts, typed, filed, forgotten. But the memory persisted, in letters, in interviews, in the quiet conversations of women who had lived through something they could not explain to anyone who had not been there. 87 women walked into a hall expecting punishment. They found dinner instead. It did not change the war. It did not erase the past. It did not answer the questions they carried, but it gave them something else, a fact, a small, undeniable, bureaucratic fact, that even in the machinery of war, even in the architecture of captivity, even in the shadow of total collapse, there were still rules. And some of those rules said, you will not be starved, you will not be forgotten, you will be fed. It was not enough, but it was something. And for women who had nothing, something was everything.